Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. The mission of FFF is to present an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the free society. And as part of that mission, we have put together a drug war video project whose aim is to accelerate an end to the war on drugs. And I'm pleased to have as my guest today Doug Bandow, who is senior fellow at the Cato Institute, which is one of the premier libertarian think tanks in the country. Doug is an attorney. He has done fantastic work over the years advancing liberty. He's written a lot for FFF. He's appeared on all the major networks. His op-eds have appeared all over the country. And he's really a world traveler. He goes in different countries and writes on events that are taking place in that country. So welcome, Doug.
Hey, happy to be on.
Yeah, so why don't we start out with just your basic idea of why you oppose the war on drugs. You've written about this over the years. Give us your perspective as to why you oppose this war and what do you think ought to be done.
Well, the most basic sense is the war on drugs really is a war on a free society. It's a war on liberty. I mean, it attacks liberty at so many levels in terms of we as human beings having control over our own bodies, over what we ingest, over our own futures, the attack on civil liberties, the attack on families, I mean, even spirals out internationally in terms of support for the worst kind of repression abroad. So to me, this really is something that affects almost every element of social life. I think it's hideous in terms of its impact.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about it that sort of distinguishes libertarians from other people. I mean, for us, liberty really is an important thing. But what do you say about people that say look, drugs are harmful. People get addicted to them, and why should people be free to do something that really damages themselves and damages society? Wouldn't we be better off if people are not ingesting harmful substances?
Well, I can certainly agree that, in fact, people shouldn't ingest harmful substances. That just doesn't tell us anything about, the state's role. I think ultimately we've got to ask, are human beings free or not? My view is we answer ultimately to a higher power for how we live our lives. We will be judged accordingly, but that has nothing to do with government. And look around us, lots of people engage in lots of harmful activities. I mean, do you start with drugs? Do you start with cigarettes? Do you start with alcohol? What about people who engage in dangerous sporting activities, extreme sports? Why on earth should you risk your life, in terms of whether it be skiing or any number of other things? The problem here is it's easy for us to look at other people's lives and want to run them for them. The consequences of that, though, are horrendous. First, I think in simply the sense of you're not going to have a free society if you simply allow everyone to decide what everyone else can do. And how that turns out in practice, again, you look at the drug war, throwing people in jail because we don't want them to hurt themselves. Creating warfare on the streets because we don't want people to hurt themselves. Kind of destroying families, taking people away from, their families for years and years. Now, this is not something which helps people. This is no answer to the question, well, aren't drugs harmful? Lots of things are harmful. The drug war, in my view, is even more harmful.
Yeah. Define for me, though, then the limits, because an average person that isn't familiar with libertarian principles would say, well, gosh, should people free to do anything, murder people and assault people and so forth? Give me the libertarian limit then on how you define a free society.
The basic view is that we should be able to act as we wish if the consequences are primarily our own. That is, other people have rights, so we can't go around and violate their right to life. We can't go shoot people, commit assault, kill people, because they have a right, to that themselves. The challenge for any societies where rights seem to come into conflict. But that's not the case if I sit here and I smoke cigarettes or I sit here and smoke pot. If I make mistakes and cause harm, I should be held accountable. We do that with alcohol. If you drive and drink and you cause an accident, well, if you're at fault, you should be held accountable. But we don't go out there and say, oh, look at what you're doing to yourself. This is terrible. We should throw you in jail. So that's really what we're looking at here. The notion is, in a free society, we're always going to have that intersection of how we affect other people, and we can't go out there and harm other people. But, for the most part, when we're talking about consequences of our own, which we are responsible for, we should be held accountable. But those are not things other people should show up and then say, I have a better idea. I know how you can live your life. I know a better way for you. I'm going to impose that upon you, and we're violating my rights.
All right, you've given the moral case here, and I know you're a devout Christian. What do you say to Christians that say, look, Doug, by calling for drug legalization, you're really violating religious principles, Christian principles. Some even suggest that you're advocating the use of drugs, that you're condoning it by calling for legalization. How do you respond to those people?
It's funny for me to argue this issue. I've never used any of them. In fact, I just came back last week from a trip to Denver, and I was tempted to stop off and go somewhere and see if I could actually give pot a try, since I've never tried it. Kind of tempting to say maybe at this age I should go see what it's like. So as a Christian, my view is, in fact, the Scripture says the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. There's a reason to protect it, a reason to view it as something that's more important and has interest to God as well as me. But there's nothing that says the answer of somebody who's violating that is to actually run off to government. And people do a lot of dumb things. I weigh too much. I eat too much. That's not good for my body. I know people who smoke cigarettes. People can use alcohol to excess. People do bad things. My view, my reading of Christian Scripture is you answer to God for that. There's a wonderful parable where Jesus says, he's out there talking about, the problem of sin, and his followers are saying, well, should we go out there, and get the people who are sinners? And he says, well, imagine a farmer. You plant wheat, and then weeds grow up in it. He said, don't go out there and pulling up the weeds where you're destroying the wheat. He said, that's a final harvest. God does the final harvest. My view is on drug use, look, if you're violating God's law, that's going to be a problem between you and God. The notion we turn that over to civil authorities, the idea that we get somebody in government to decide, well, how much harm is enough to your body? Is 1 drink a day okay? 5 drinks a day is not. Who regulates that? We'll throw you in jail otherwise. None of that strikes me as having anything to do with Christian Scripture. That as a Christian, I have to answer to God. I have responsibilities to others. It doesn't set up a system of government. It certainly doesn't justify having government officials to come in there and claim to be God's agents, acting on behalf of God. We've seen how that worked out throughout history. It doesn't work out very well for liberty or for good theology, in my view.
Yeah, I agree with you that there's a lot of sinful conduct that doesn't involve the violation of people's rights, and in terms of the initiation of force. And adultery, to me, is a classic example, is that simply because libertarians want to legalize adultery, that is, don't have the state punish people who engage in it, doesn't mean we condone it, doesn't mean we approve it. Let's talk about...
It's a big mistake to act as if legalization is somehow viewed as the same thing as urging its use. To my mind, the role of the state is to protect people in their rights. It's to protect us from harm from others. That is, from violations of liberty, of murder, of assault, of fraud. That's what government is for. You don't make something against the law because, well, you want the government to show it's a bad thing. That's not why you bring in government. We as a society have other institutions where we can show moral disapproval, teach against it, work against it. That doesn't mean you make it against the law.
Yeah, there's institutions in civil society that can deal with drug addiction and drug abuse, right?
Absolutely. That's a far better way to do it. Again, faith-based programs on addiction are good programs. They're going out to people and saying, reaching kind of within you, trying to transform you. It's not we throw you in jail. It's we're trying to make you a better person, understand why it's in your interest. We're trying to transform the way you look at yourself. That that comes from civil society. That comes from society well beyond politics. I mean, politicians are not very good at that stuff. We don't want them to try to take over and mold our souls. That really is a very bad thing to turn over to the state.
All right, that's the moral case, the freedom case for ending the drug war. Let's talk about what we call the utilitarian case, the practical consequences of the war on drugs. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, if you look at the war on drugs, it's hard to see any aspect of it that looks like a good thing. I mean, we have well over 1 million people in jail, come into contact with the justice system every year because of drug offenses. We have something like 140,000 people, in jail. I mean, the federal prisons are filled in particular with people, in terms of drug offenses. It's an outrage. And so many of these people, because of mandatory minimum laws, what we do is we see people sentences longer than you get for rape or for murder for possession of drugs. Well, it's the second strike, third strike, off you go. This makes no sense. I mean, it's a very bad use of resources. It's also, it's hurting people. And everything that comes out of that is what I would call a self-victim crime. That is, drug use is something that's bad for you. It's primarily a crime in a sense against yourself, not against others. The only way you prosecute that is through all of these very intrusive steps. That is, you have to go out there and use informants. You have to use wiretaps. There's that tendency to break search and seizure laws, the Fourth Amendment. Because how do you catch people? You've got to find the stuff. They don't turn it over to you. So what we find is a constant assault on the Fourth Amendment. We have all of these horrible drug raids, very often going to the wrong apartment, shooting people. We see drug war on the street where you go out there because everything's illegal. This is all off into a criminal world. We've created a whole crime realm. We had that with alcohol. We don't have it with alcohol today because we legalized it. To me, that alcohol, that change from prohibition, as we called it with alcohol, to legalization, you eliminated the gang influence. You eliminated all of the state raids. You eliminated the violence, the arrests, and you were able then to treat it as a medical problem, a social problem, a health problem, as alcoholism should be, not as a criminal law problem. We've got to do the same in terms of drugs.
Well, you mentioned about the overcrowded prisons and the many people whose lives have been ruined, not just by drugs, but by putting them in jail for extended periods of times for using or possessing or distributing drugs. So what do you think should be done about all those people?
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense. Certainly the nonviolent offenders should be out. I think President Obama deserves credit because he has been commuting sentences. He's done more than any previous president. Still a lot more to go, but that at least is a start, where you simply say people who are in prison for nonviolent offenses on drug offenses should be out. And that should be part of the process of legalization. As we look, for example, as states increasingly legalize marijuana, any state that legalizes marijuana, it strikes me the governor should be releasing people who actually are non-violent offenders. And you should be getting those people out. If a state has decided this is a really dumb law, let the people out. That's a starting point. Over the long term, we've got to empty prisons of people with drug offenses. It means legalizing in terms of use and sale of drugs, but it also means letting people out who've been prosecuted under the old laws.
Well, what do you say to people that say, look, the real problem with the war on drugs is that we really haven't waged a war on drugs, that if we really were to crack down, maybe even get the military involved, that we could really win this war?
I think it's a fantasy. The idea we haven't been waging a war on drugs. Tell that to the tens of thousands of people who've been thrown into jail. Tell that to the millions of people over the years who've gone through the judicial system, the criminal law system. Tell that, especially within, say, the African American community, so many young men who are in some way or another have been touched by neighborhoods that have been destroyed by the illegal drug trade, the war on drugs, the police presence, these sorts of things. The notion that we haven't been fighting a war on drugs is complete nonsense. Tell that to the Colombians. Tell that to other societies where the U.S. has supported vicious and militaristic drug eradication campaigns. Look today, if you want to have a really tough campaign, we'll go to the Philippines. 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 drug users and dealers have been murdered by security forces since the new president took over. Do we think that's the way you want to run our society? Do we believe in a rule of law? Again, what are we achieving with this? Even this kind of an approach doesn't stop hardcore drug users. What it simply does is results in mass killing. It coarsens our entire society. It really wrecks the whole civil liberties for the rest of us. Constitutional lawyers talk about the drug exception to the Fourth Amendment, where judges and police and prosecutors all look the other way when they know the law is being violated because it's the only way you can prosecute people. You have to ask, what do people think we're going to achieve out of that? The consequences are far worse than anything you can argue about. What is the harm of the average marijuana user, for example, using marijuana?
Yeah, your point about the Philippines is very good because it seems to me like the Philippines is sort of the model of what's happening there under President Duterte of what would, at a minimum, have to be done to win the war on drugs. Would you talk a little bit about what's going on there? What exactly, who is Duterte, what his plan for winning the war on drugs is and what he's doing over there?
Well, Rodrigo Duterte won this past summer. He's gotten a lot of attention on the issue of whether the U.S. should have military bases there. He rather high-profile insult to President Obama. That's gotten probably most of the attention because it affects American military interests, and it's gotten policymakers in Washington all upset. The notion there might be one country on earth where we don't have bases, of course, horrifies Washington. But, he got elected in part because of his tough-on-drug stance. He was a mayor, and he adopted the same policies there, though just for his own city. He essentially gave the police free rein. So basically, go out and kill anybody you want who's involved in the drug trade. We're going to stop this. Now, as president, he basically told the security forces there will be no repercussions. There will be no oversight. There will be no accountability. You go out there, you stop the drug trade, and I don't care how. So thousands of people literally have been gunned down. This is extrajudicial violence. I mean, there's no rule of law. It's extraordinary. And no doubt, you're killing people. Those people, I guess, in the future won't be using drugs. But again, the likelihood this will eliminate drug use, we found, attempts to use very severe measures. They've happened in Thailand, in some of the Muslim countries. I mean, there are a number of these places. This stuff doesn't go away. It's driven further underground. And I think Duterte is going to find, it's a fragile society anyway. It's always been a rather weak government. This is extraordinarily dangerous for any society where you kind of loose this violence without any control, and the assumption state officials will contain themselves and will only go out and get the guilty people, I think is an illusion. Very dangerous there, and I think Filipinos at some point will recognize that, this is the really horrid approach. At the end of the day, they're going to have wrecked any kind of a rule of law, and you're going to have this huge body count, and there will still be people using drugs. This is no answer.
Yeah, I mean, you theoretically you end up with a total police state, and even if it succeeds in a society in which people are so scared to death, including the addicts, that they don't use drugs or they can't get their hands on drugs, who wants to live in that kind of society?
At what price are you willing to pay?
Right. Now, you mentioned that to a certain extent that's happening here in this country with the assaults on the Fourth Amendment and the Constitution. Tell us a little bit about that. I know you're a lawyer, and give us a little bit of the background on what happens there with respect to search and seizure and automobile stops and the like.
Well, normal crimes, there's a complaining witness. If somebody assaults me, I want the police to find the person who assaulted me. If there's a murder, there's somebody who wants to make sure that crime is solved. There are going to be people out there who may have seen it and been involved. Well, on drug offenses, essentially what you're doing is trying to prosecute two willing participants. I'm the user, you're the dealer. Neither of us wants the police involved. So the only way the state can crack down on that, it has to find other ways. So that means it needs surveillance. It has to put on wiretaps. It has to search us. It searches our homes. It searches our cars. So you get these kind of ridiculous cases where the stop and frisk, where you try to, the state comes up with these rules that, I think they're acting suspiciously. What does that mean? Well, very often it means you're African American, young and male. So obviously you're acting suspiciously. So I'm going to pat you down. I found drugs. I'm going to arrest you. Well, this clearly violates Fourth Amendment. I mean, the founders wanted to protect us. Stopping automobiles. These sorts of things where, again, What's the supposed suspicion? I stop you. I ask for your permission. I may do it anyway. You talk to prosecutors and police. I mean, law enforcement against prohibition has a number of former law enforcement officials, and they admit that police lie. And they do so. This is not to suggest these are evil people. Their view is they're fighting a great evil. They're frustrated. How can you do that? How do you prosecute people? You've got to find this. Well, you search people. You violate the law, and then you say, no, they gave consent. And judges look the other way. Prosecutors look the other way. It permeates the system. To me, Fourth Amendment is one of the bedrock constitutional liberties for all of us. Protection of our homes, protection of our privacy. You don't want to invite police in. When they passed the Patriot Act, when they passed these anti-terrorism measures, they started using these extreme measures that are supposed to protect us from foreign enemies. They use them in the drug war. They take advantage of any kind of powers that they have.
Yeah, well, tell us a little bit about the corruption that comes with the drug war, specifically like things with asset forfeiture and the effect that it has on the judicial system itself.
Whereas, again, the difference between real crimes, and kind of this commercial activity they're trying to suppress, is the fact that for the most part, you don't get much cases of corruption involving an assault case. I mean, it would have to be some direct buy-off, somebody who had a lot of money and pays you. Oh, please don't go out there and arrest me. Very rare. The problem when you come into the drug war, it's not just drugs. Some of these other things, prostitution and stuff, you get the same kind of issues. But the drug war in particular, drugs is big business. Huge amount of money there. So it's very easy, especially because a lot of cops on the beat view this as futile. They're in there day in and day out. They see people using. They know how big it is. So it's relatively easy. The drug dealer on your beat says, hey, all you have to do is look the other way. $1,000 a month. Everybody's happy. Don't bother us. And from your standpoint as a cop, why not? The point is you can't stop it anyway. There's really no reason this should be against the law. Huge amount of money coming in. What you found is that it can even affect prosecutors. It affects judges. It kind of permeates the system. They've even had times where the military's been involved. You see it affecting even the U.S. military at times they've tried to use it. You certainly see that overseas. If you look at a country like Mexico, Colombia, Peru, a number of these countries where massive drug trade, Afghanistan, we're supposed to be fighting a war over there. Huge drug trade. People talk about it's a narco state. The amount of opium, the money that floods the system. So what you're doing is undermining and degrading the entire society. You're doing that to American institutions. I want the police to be honest and effective to stop real crimes. I don't want them dragged into something where they shouldn't be involved, where in fact you're suddenly busy tempting them and bringing them on the other side of the law. It's going to have implications for a lot of other areas as well as the drug area.
And well, isn't there also an impact in addition to what you're talking about on the supply side, on the demand side, in terms of regular Americans, laws of supply and demand, economic principles?
Well, absolutely. The problem with the drug market is it is a genuine market. People want to use drugs. This is not something artificial. Again, alcohol prohibition. Go back and look at our own history a century ago. Well-meaning people looked and said, oh, alcohol use is bad. People get drunk. Families get harmed. Alcoholics are out there. They're addicted. All of these terrible things. You had a movement, the prohibition. There was even a party, a political party that focused on this. The famous kind of Carrie Nation going out there and smashing saloons. There was a moral impulse behind this, but it couldn't eliminate it. People still wanted to drink. So the moment it became against the law, everything went underground. Of course, that's where we saw suddenly the demand moves not from the legal into the illegal. And of course, that brings a whole set of other consequences. You can't have any assurance of quality. So you get stills, you get all the bad stuff, you get rot gut, you get people who go blind because of the bad stuff out there. How do you kind of resolve business differences? In a normal free society, you can sue somebody. You have contracts. You have a rule of law. When it's all illegal, the way you solve business disputes is you kill each other. You have shootouts. You turn inner city neighborhoods, into criminal kind of battlegrounds. All of this comes out of the fact that there's a demand. The supply is going to show up. Huge profits to be made. The point is, if it's illegal, the legitimate producers and suppliers aren't involved. Where does it go? It goes to people who are willing to be part of this violent world. They make huge amounts of money, and that's, of course, what spreads then into the corruption, massive amounts of money to be spread around. This is a huge commercial enterprise. The state is getting involved in turning all those incentives in a very negative way that attack our free institutions.
Yeah, and it ends up inducing a lot of ordinary people who would never get involved in such a thing because of the exorbitant profits to be made. I mean, like flight attendants and so forth that are smuggling in a load of cocaine. I mean, it really has a distorting effect across society. Talk a little bit about...
Think of the incentive provided. I can make so much money this one trip.
Yeah.
You see how you get approached. Come on, one thing in, it won't be a problem. You'll make 10 grand. Hey, what the heck? Why not? And then all these people get caught. They end up in jail. Their lives are ruined. And there's always somebody else to replace them. It's not like the stuff doesn't get in. Even the authorities admit, they find 1, 2, 3, 5% of the incoming influx of drugs. What on earth are they achieving? This entire drug war isn't stopping drugs, raising the price a bit. It's not stopping supplies.
Yeah, that's a great point because, you're a lawyer. I practiced law for several years. I mean, we've seen this. I mean, 30 years ago, we've seen the drug bust. We've seen where they bust the big cartels, the prosecutions, the record drug busts. And this has been going on for decades. But to what avail, Doug? What's it accomplished?
You always think of the press conferences, where they lay out all the drugs in front and say, the biggest bust ever. That's our $1 million street value. Well, number one, it has that street value because it's illegal. If it was a legal market, it wouldn't be worth any of that. The point is it'd be all cheap. But the second is every day they're coming up with a new record drug bust. And why? If the past drug bust worked, this shouldn't be there. If they had a handle on it, if they were stopping it from coming in, there shouldn't be new record drug busts. But the point is so much is coming in, they can have a record drug bust every day, and it doesn't matter. Everyone who wants to use drugs will still be able to buy them. So today we have the worst of both worlds. We have lots of drug use, and we have all the ill consequences of prohibition. And the other side keeps saying, well, if we legalize, think of all the bad things that'll happen. My reaction is, well, we have all that today, plus all the problems of prohibition, plus war in the streets, plus mass corruption, plus mass incarceration, lives ruined, families destroyed, communities destroyed. What on earth are we getting out of this?
All right, let's wrap it up by giving me your scenario of what would happen if the drug war were ended. If drugs were legalized today, give us the consequences of what would happen.
I think the consequences would be surprisingly small in the sense that my sense is that people who have a real drug problem or are susceptible to a real drug problem already use drugs. The legalization of drugs, not just marijuana but others, is likely to lead to more experimentation. But I think the number of people who would add it on, who would ruin their lives and their families, would be relatively small. That we already deal with the greatest challenge, which is those who have that internal chemistry that makes them most vulnerable. And I think if you eliminate all these legal, the criminal law aspects, we still left with a social problem. We have a social problem with alcohol. It's real. There's people who abuse alcohol. But what that tells us is the premium then is to treat this for the problem that it is. It's a health problem. It's a moral problem. It's a spiritual problem. It matters to people. It's hurting people. We find the other institutions out there to help them. Most social problems, we don't say the answer to that is to throw them in jail. Oh, you have a social problem. Let's put you off in a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. That will fix it. We don't typically address human problems that way. This will challenge us because we have to find new answers. We've been throwing it off to the criminal law system. But to me, that's the wonderful thing of a free society. A free society has people who are active, they organize, they care about other people, multiple institutions they can create. That, to me, is what we look at as we legalize drugs. And I'm quite excited. We had good results out of the 2016 elections, California being the biggest state, but across the country, Maine, Massachusetts. We had a number of other countries states that legalized for medical marijuana, which I think is a step forward. I think marijuana is moving very strongly that way. I don't see how the federal prohibition can survive. We're going to have to deal with this challenge, and I think we're up to it. It'll be a much better society if we do so.
Doug, thanks for coming on and sharing these excellent perspectives with us.
Happy to be on. Take care now.